Hello everyone and welcome to one of the day 20 sessions of the Festive Tech calendar for 2022. Today's session is a customer journey to the cloud starts here. My name is Dimitar Grozdanov and shout out to all cloud family current and future members that would enjoy viewing this session. A short about me. I've been here for a while. I'm an old man yelling at cloud from a uh, personal professional standpoint. A couple of links where you can find me and or see what I do. I'm also an active member of the IT Pro community group in North Macedonia, one of the founding members as well. I work as a freelancer, consultant and trainer, and I've been operating and or attached to Azure since it was called Red Dog in the old days when I used to work for Microsoft. As part of today's topic, this is a kind of a must read that it is part of the session because all the correlation I'm gonna do and some of the tips and practices and some experiences I found out are based on working with the Cloud Adoption Framework, with the Azure well-architected framework in areas of reliability, security, cost optimization, operational excellence, as well as performance efficiency. I utilize the Azure reference architectures, the design patterns that exist there. It's evolving content, so Cloud Adoption Framework, well-architected framework, the reference architectures, the patterns, everything gets updated as soon as new things are either added as part of the service or introduced as a possible way how to solve some issue. I emphasize here the Azure subscription limits and quotas. It is a thing to consider, especially in related also to the capabilities of the resource providers and, embedded with the model of naming, because different resource providers provide different structure of the name. So if you need to generate something for your customer or for your organization, you would need to be aware of what are the capabilities and limits there, and as well tagging, which is also part of the overall story over there. Now, as part of the cloud journey, right, and what we are actually achieving, we are trying to build something, right? We are trying to build, if I use the reference here, a house, maybe a stadium or a building or a bridge, a highway, whatever is there, which means there will be a subset of components and or functionalities and or features that need to be embedded within that specific design and structure, right? Now, and yes, ultimately, the final solution might look like a house, like a building, like a yard, park, bridge, whatever, but still it has to have, based on a specific purpose it serves, yes, it will have a specific functionality embedded, but it has specific foundation that we need to consider. And some of those things are universal, right? We need to start with some selection of services. We need to see what capabilities these services have. We need to make these services interact between each other. We might need to integrate something that was already there, something that is already on premises, and then manage that hybrid scenario as well. We need to figure out on a per service and a per complexity of services what are my specific operational parameters, what governance, what security, right, what management model I'm going to implement, and so on and so forth, right. Either way, we are going to talk about specific, well, maybe not in details, but we're going to talk about specifics within these frameworks, and then some findings or best practices or guidance I can advise you to, in order for either not to make the same mistakes or perceive specific scenarios and situations you might find when you do your own projects. Now, the overall structure of the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure is consistent of these, let's say, seven components, right? We have the strategy side, where we start planning, and then once we do the definition of strategy, we can kind of drill into the specific planning areas. Then we look at the readiness phase, out of which the adoption phase, within kind of three ways how it can span, happens until we get to the kind of a final product, something running inside the Azure environment. The security, governance, and management is something that follows through the whole process end to end, from the beginning to the end, and kind of again starts from scratch, right? Now, as far as the defining the strategy, right? So there are a couple of things we need to look at here. Now, if we look at the Cloud Adoption Framework, It's quite comprehensive information you'll find there in regards to motivations, specific business outcomes and justification, which will actually help ultimately to prioritize the project. Now in this phase particularly, we do tend to talk not only inside the IT operations environment, so I'm going to generalize everything that touches upon the IT infrastructures, IT operations, whether it's development, infrastructure, networking, security, whatever is there, help desk operations, so any kind of operations there. Which means we need to look at not only the inside the technical acumen, but also expand that to the business units, the actual application owners from a business side, the financial part of the organization, also portions of the sales organization. So we would understand what critical, let's say, business events drive this motivation to move to the cloud. Right? Now, yeah, if you look at the slide, the usual suspects would be, yes, I have a fairly old data center. I have some specific maybe system integrator lock-in that I want to avoid. There is a plan of modernizing, which means a certain amount of capital expenditure needs to be thrown in inside, which means we would like to either avoid it or minimize it. It can be based on mergers, acquisitions, right? Diversification of the company portfolio, right? Like a group or holding of some kind. Might be related to specific governance, compliance, regulatory restrictions and or imposed requirements from the either internal or external factors as well. And supports or kind of stepping out of the support cycle for legacy systems to avoid further disruption of the services we offer towards our customers, meaning internal or external in this case, right? And then based on that, we map the so-called migration or innovation type of motivations, right? The idea here is also to support the process how we're going to proceed with the cloud adoption, right? Ultimately. Right? So if you look at the kind of, yeah, I want to exit my current data center, so I want to move to the cloud, right? So optimize some costs, reduce some vendor or technical complexity, for example, from that standpoint, enable better scalability and availability of my services. Yeah, I can mix and match those, right? The idea here is to talk with the customer and or the specific business owners inside our organization and figure out what the proper way to approach this would be, right? And this needs to be documented always, right? Not to forget that. In regards to innovation, this is a kind of an approach where we would primarily look at the specific new technical or technology capabilities that the cloud would offer to us as an organization or towards the organization where we want to implement this if we are the partner side of the org, right? Which means they want to improve certain interactions either with their customers on a larger scale, especially if they expand their portfolio and try to kind of acquire new markets and or push or publish new products, new services that or maybe they hadn't had a chance to use them before from that standpoint. But either way, that one would take a little bit more programmatic approach to the planning phase, and we're going to talk a little bit about that one later on. One of the important factors that are part of this strategic alignment is the financial side, right? Ultimately, it will boil down to money. Right? I had a couple of scenarios where CIOs I worked, and well, this particular example is banking environment, where we did our due diligence in regards to kind of the strategizing and portions of the planning, and then we came to the phase, yeah, we want to go and take this to the kind of the board and get some financial approval of that, right? The CIO was not properly prepped to handle that conversation in this case, right? Once he got there to the board, once they saw the slides, that was a language they did not understand. Yeah, from an IT perspective, I completely understand what that person wanted to achieve, what was their ultimate goal here. But for finance people, that was something garbled, right? That was Klingon to them, right? They didn't completely understand what's going on, so they defaulted to the money. And then instead of I don't know 30 minutes, the presentation took 7 minutes because once they saw the first two slides, figured out they don't understand it. Okay, let's move to the end. How much? And there was a hard no afterward, right? Uh, it has to be aligned with specific either strategic processes running or financial processes in regards to current financial position, any specific key performance indicators in the finance side, and how that would inflict specific processes, right? If I need to initiate a specific process to get the approval for funding, which would cause a ripple inside my financial, administrative, and compliance environment, probably they will say no initially to the project. So covering all angles is also an important thing. And I understand, coming from an IT background, it's not always easy to talk to the non-IT people. But remember, the door swings both ways. They also don't understand us when we talk about the beauty of the cloud or this specific technology or component or whatever we are trying to show to them, right? So we need to figure out somewhere in the middle or preferably leaning towards outside. As far as the technical benefits of moving to the cloud, right? So obvious ones: scalability, availability, security, compliance, and capacity optimization, right? Um, Scalability implies that, right, we have the option or the ability to scale out our resources depending on what we have as usage, right, in a specific momentum. Because we do not need to pre-invest in capacity, which comes down to the fourth in the line here, capacity optimization. Right? If you remember back in the days when we started from physical servers and then we moved to our first virtualization environment, right? It was not one-to-one match. We sized the hardware to accommodate more virtual machines, so compared to the physical machines we run in the environment. One of the things was there because we would estimate what our future growth would be, or in case of a failure of multiple nodes, so we have a node that will handle all the business critical workloads there, right? The scalability here in Azure specifically, whether we're talking about infrastructure or platform, in certain cases comes embedded as part of the infrastructure, right? Which makes sense for the infrastructure side, or it's embedded in the platform service itself to a certain level. The availability side, right? When we figure out how to solve the availability on on-premises, again, we overestimate things. We introduce multiple hardware components, multiple software components that will support that. So if we figure out that everything is software-defined something, software-defined networking, right? We have the virtualization, which is a abstraction layer on top of the hardware, which enables us to size the number of instances of services we're going to run, multiple locations we need to consider, how do we connect them, what appliances we use, high availability in the appliance, etc., right? So we need to think about a lot of moving parts to embed that, right? Now, yeah, it's nice if we have a single location, small mid-sized organization, couple of users, right? But the bigger the organization gets, or depending on the business, it has multiple endpoint locations from where users connect to the central environment, then this becomes a little bit more of a problem, right? And based on the business criticality of the system and what impact it has if it stops working, then we need to either invest on the application side, so you can run some form of a caching or local storing of some data, but at a certain point that data needs to get to the centralized location, and or figure out how we're going to enable kind of a continuous model of uploading that data to the central location. And again, scalability, availability, if we kind of jump on the last one, the capacity optimization, right? What I usually say is when we look at the on-premises data center environments, that's a static environment compared to any cloud side, whether it's infrastructure, platform, or software as a service environment, right? Because we pre-invest and lock certain resources in the hardware structure inside the environment. Once we hit the wall on that side, there is no elasticity capability. I cannot just over provision. I cannot expand. I cannot move to a different data center location maybe that easily, right? Maybe I have 2 or 3 data centers where I can kind of move the data around with all the scalability and availability moving parts there. But then again, if I do capacity optimization, yeah, pretty much, especially in a data center, we invest to enable certain capacity, and then we wait for the next cycle. But if something comes as an unpredictable momentum, which means, yeah, business suddenly rises, we have more utilization for application service 1 that we produced last month, and suddenly we're out of capacity there, right? Any form of provisioning, deprovisioning inside the cloud, it's far easier than the one in on-premises. And again, remember, when we moved from physical to virtual environment, it was not one-to-one. Also, when we move from a highly virtualized or a private cloud environment on premises, not necessarily everything will go one-to-one depending on what type of service we use on the other side as well. Yeah, in a kind of a direct move of a subset of virtual machines, again, we can achieve additional cost optimization. Last but not least, here would be the security and compliance. Right? Since the Azure Cloud Platform is being managed by Microsoft, which means there is an embedded specific security and compliance standards and regulations that the data center facility that operates in a certain region must abide to, right? So there is a subset of tools that will tell us what's the security and compliance status of our environment. In some cases, it will kind of overstate the information, right? Give us more information compared to the services you run, but we can always tweak and fine-tune that, right? So there are some things that are as is, but there are some things we can look and focus that are very relevant to our services and components of services you run inside that environment. Right? Anything happening on the actual environment from a kind of a global network perspective, right? Denial of service attacks, any attempts of malicious activities will be flagged. So it does not imply that we're going to kind of dismiss that from our operations, but we can rely on already built-in capabilities and functionalities within the Azure that are actually coming as is, for which we either need to use multiple tools or introduce multiple components in our environments as part of our defense in depth or zero trust methodology and strategy we have to implement it on premises, and then span that to multiple devices, multiple locations, etc., etc. Right? So it becomes very complex. Now, as far as the kind of lesson learned during the strategy definition side, right? So I've seen quite a lot falling for the buzzwords, right? Digital transformation, cloud. Private cloud was for it. So every era has its own buzzword that it's kind of there. And I've seen scenarios where a C-level executive goes literally by the, if everyone uses it, then we have to use it too. I had a scenario like that when I was working for Microsoft. I had one of my customers on Friday, the CIO calls me. Says, okay, on Monday you have to come into the office and you need to talk with the business side a little bit. I worked as a technology advisor for that account specifically. Says, okay, so what's the 411, right? Give me the details. So what should I talk on Monday? So he says, okay, the CEO was on some event where he went on a kind of a digital transformation, cloud is beautiful and this is the way to go session. He pulled every C-level executive or senior executive on Friday at 2 in the afternoon and told them on Monday we move to the cloud. So yeah, it doesn't happen like that. I mean, nothing happens like that. Not related only to IT and IT operations, but nothing in life happens like that, let's face it, right? Which means, yeah, we have a failure to communicate scenario, right? So there is a business to IT miscommunication, because what's the ultimate goal here? I have to go there because everybody goes there. It's like I'm not going to say that one. What exactly we want to achieve here? Right? Do we do it because, right, what's the critical event that motivated us to move there, right? And then going back to that list, you will definitely find some things that are relevant to some scenario you have in your customer. I mean, that list was not compiled by chance, right? It is something that you can relate to, which means your business side of the customers, include your sales and business units, can relate to it, so it can be communicated properly, right? The lack of visibility and strategy, right? Again, moving to the cloud just for the sakes of moving it there, right? So it's the new best thing that can happen. We have to have it, right? It's like procuring the latest version of your phone in some cases, or getting the device or the car, whatever, because yeah, everybody has it, so we have to have it, right? Although some scenarios would go under the model one size fits all, it doesn't work like that. I worked, if you look at the statement of work and the requirements and the strategic portion of the document, right, the critical business drivers were exactly the same in, I don't know, more than 3, as I can remember from top of my mind here, customers I had. But the actual cloud journey was different for everyone. The cloud adoption plan has subtle differences. Even most of the services there, governance security models were pretty much, give or take a few lines, the same. Let's not say they were identical, but even if they're identical, the cloud journey and the cloud adoption process will be different. Because there is a lot of moving parts. And even if service 1 and service 2 and customer A and customer B might look the same, ultimately, when you architect, when you design it, when you deploy it, when you operate it, right, when you secure it, it's not the same. Yes, there are architectural diagrams you can use and reuse, but any subtle changes inside some components would inflict that that architecture is changed, which means it's not anymore one-to-one match to the one I had. So on a strategic side, poorly defined strategy, no clear definition of goals, perspectives, what direction we're going to take, that's a problem. On one hand, it will take you forever to finalize it. On the other hand, yeah, it will probably fail. Once we get to the plan, eventually worst case scenario to the adopt phase. Now the beauty of the model with the cloud adoption plan is that we can actually, once we define the strategy, we have some mechanisms later on that will determine the momentum, whether we maybe need to go back to the drawing board and maybe re-strategize. Which means the more complex the organization and environment is, right, ultimately it won't take 3 days to 3 weeks, might take longer, right? I've seen projects that last for a couple of weeks to a couple of months, but I've seen projects that the initial strategy and planning phase were almost 2 years. Again, complex organizations. So I wouldn't expect also for you from the immediately to make the the initial version of the documentation and everything that goes ultimately in the cloud adoption plan as kind of bulletproof and perfect. But again, remember, it's a journey. Right, it's all about the process, not only about the destination at the end. And then last but not least here, I also see a lot is the living the comfort zone, right? Fear of the unknown, which happens if you get into a room and suddenly you throw in some nice things and you're already proficient in the strategy / planning phase, right? Let's say we strategize good, but then the other side is not that ready, right? From a business perspective, yes, by relating to the business side of the problem, right? Capital versus operational expenditures, financial stuff, which might be our uncomfort zone there. Right, again, we need to find each other in the middle somewhere, right? But comfort zone is also difficult for IT roles as well. I've been in several sessions where we discuss certain architecture and design, and then I kind of partially get attacked by certain role inside. Sometimes it's networking, sometimes it's infrastructure, sometimes it's somebody from a help desk or other operational segment there. At the early age or days of cloud adoption, the biggest fear was losing your job. And I had a scenario like that. We were doing a session for one of the utilities, and we're discussing on strategizing and planning what would be the difference between investing in a kind of a separate segment of the private cloud with extension to DMZ, or should we move that actually component inside Azure. We use it, we test it there. If we don't like it, we can fastly decommission rather than procuring hardware. Although there was an option, if the hardware doesn't fall through and the project gets scrapped, it will be placed inside their current private cloud environment, which also meant a complex process of evaluating whether that specific hardware component would fit in with the ones they have, which couldn't be the case because there was kind of a tendering process, and maybe a different hardware vendor would pop in and different hardware revision would be there. Either way, when we were talking about networking in intercontinuity hybrid, I actually had the networking person stand up and literally yell at me saying, oh, you want to automate everything, you want to set up everything in Azure, everything there works, everything is software defined, everything is configured, I want to have nothing to do here, I'm going to lose my job. Just kind of an awkward situation, right? There was 15 people in the room, and I personally knew all 15 of them. I was their technology advisor at that time, right? So we had a long history of working together, and I've never seen a scenario where I would suggest something like that even mildly in my mind, right? Whenever I discuss hybrid or moving to the cloud, right, there are certain components that will exist there. So I had to go back to the drawing board and explain that pretty much everything is connected to the network, and probably the networking personnel would be the last one to consider anything happening like that. But the comfort zone can be also part of literally the unknown. I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, I have some vague knowledge of what the cloud is. Probably these days you wouldn't be in that position, but you can have, especially if you're working on a specialized component inside IT, which means you're connected to that component, that specific operations. Usually in larger organizations, the abiding rule here is if it ain't broken, don't fix it, right? So that expertise lies within that system, right? And especially in a monolithic environment, and that's very sometimes difficult to break it down, right? But then again, it's psychology rather than maybe, ooh, I don't know this, but I can always learn, right? So it's a psychological barrier primarily that I see rather than ooh, I'm that afraid of the unknown from that standpoint. But it can happen, and it can have an impact because cloud technology and introducing it into an organization is a disruptive process. Right, so let's get back on track a little bit. So we defined our strategy, it's been approved, we have the budgeting, we have the timeline, we have the corrective measures, we have the capability of starting the planning, which means we need to look at the components we see inside, right? The construct of the digital estate, right? We also need to figure out what the organizational alignment would be, prepare the skills for that organization, and then draft our first version at least of the cloud adoption plan so we can move forward. Now, as far as the planning goes, and now this is all part of the cloud adoption framework as such, we need to look at the assets we have. And I refer to digital estate, but these are the services we run, right? Now, by services, I will kind of generalize here. I'm talking about the application service that has all the corresponding moving parts beneath it, right? In this case, which means we need to look at the service operations side, the components, how it interacts with other components, software, hardware ones, what's our underneath infrastructure, how it's connected, our security, governance, compliance needs we have there, right? The more complex the organization is, we would have more moving parts to look at. And some assumption that Microsoft has is that you would need a week and a half per workload to assess what's going on inside. Now, there are things we can do to kind of cut the cycle and then certain decisions that need to be made. Organizational alignment is an important thing, right? So we need to align the governance, the security, the management side, and the cloud adoption process. Because introducing cloud introduces disruption. It's not only on the service operation side, but it's all across the board. Everybody will be out of their comfort zone, ultimately. We need to figure out the skills readiness, right? Sitting in front of a person and talking about the beauty and the capabilities of this and this service inside of Azure, and if that person does not understand what's going on, then you might get a hard no, or, right, unknown, comfort zone thing, so they would start pulling back and then they will revert back to the defaults. Go for what I know and object on everything. Now, all these components need to be placed in the cloud adoption plan. And I'll talk about the cloud adoption plan a little bit later. Now, the cloud adoption framework perceives two ways, traditional versus incremental rationalization process of the digital estate. The traditional one is the one that takes time. Now, the question is, how much time do we have for the planning phase? Right. So we need to do full inventory, applications, software, hardware, operating system, patch levels, versions, system performance metrics, and trust me, you won't be able to find all of this information always. In some cases, it is not available, it was lost, it's not updated, system performance metrics are not kept that long, so we'll have a kind of a better understanding what's going on there. The more silo application approaches, it bounds to specific rules. So I worked with an organization where the 100 something applications they had were each one their own silo, which had the security and governance model dictating the silo. So any application service, software component, hardware component, data storage service, whatever, including the system performance, was isolated per silos, and then multiply that 180 something times. So we can do we need to do quantitative and then qualitative analysis, right? And usually the quantitative kind of brings us to the first layer of decisions, what to do with that specific digital asset. And then the quality, it more focuses on the actual solution and what it does. So we need to go back to the application service owners, to the business owners, to power users, people that actually live with the service on a day-to-day process, right? The idea to optimize things is to drive this incremental rationalization, right? It will speed up a little the process. Now, it might generate faults, but luckily we can always go back and test the assumptions, right? This enables us to reduce the discovery data points, right? When we do the inventory. It will help us streamline the decision. It will rely on some temporary assumptions that might prove to be wrong once we get to the next stage, right? We can also challenge the assumptions, which means ultimately the quantitative analysis would be, for example, do I really need this service to move forward, or I can decommission it or replace it with something else? It also will impact, in certain cases, parallel transformation of certain services and processes. If I have a multi-service dependency, then if I need to do some, during the incremental rationalization or inventory process and then doing the qualitative analysis, we decide that these 4 or 5 components need to be transformed at the same time. We might figure out that maybe centralizing certain components to serve the other and kind of create a chain of services that will actually cover multiple components, n plus 1 and minus 1 would actually support this, right? Out of the X number of workloads, right, we figure out we want to move to the cloud. We need to select the first or the first few, right? 1, 3, let's say 5 tops, right? Business criteria, technical criteria, qualitative analysis, and cost model alignment need to be done on per service in this case, right? Business criteria would be, right, what's the business impact? Technical criteria, what's the technical technological side? Am I bound to keep that on premises due to certain so I had a scenario where the workload could not move to the cloud because the partner supporting some third-party component said, well, we don't do Azure, so we support it in a private cloud virtualized environment, but we don't support it inside Azure. I failed to see the difference in this process because it's kind of a lift and shift scenario, but let's say that's it. They have an agreement, they have an SLA there. One of the assumptions was here, right, temporary assumptions was that their team was not ready to operate with Azure, which proved later on to be the true one, right? We need to do the quality analysis, right? Consult the business side. And then based on that, what's the cost model alignment, right? It's if it's a low business impact system and it costs more to move to the cloud, maybe that's not the solution for that. Not everything can go to the cloud, in all fairness. Depending on the size, organization type, products, services, governance, compliance models, etc. As far as the choices, right? We have the rehost, which I prefer to use the move and improve instead of lift and shift. It was used by one of my fellow MVPs a while ago, which implies that, yeah, what I have on premises, I would move it to the Azure side as an infrastructure environment and improve certain operations based on the capabilities of the cloud. Not always the elegant or most preferred solution, but that okay, I will use the term fastest, although I would use quotes on that one. Nothing is fast, but we don't need to do a lot of changes just to move the workload to the cloud. The refactoring refers literally moving from an infrastructure to something that's in platform services portfolio, which will give me with minor or even zero modifications the capability I had within that infrastructure service originally, right? The re-architect and or rebuild, these are the most complex and they actually literally take us back to the drawing board, right? Re-architecting implies that whatever application service you're looking at has no clue what Azure is and what cloud services are, and it cannot interact with other services that belong to that environment, which means we need to do significant changes right? And port that solution inside Azure. On the rebuild renew, it's that can never go inside the cloud, or it's too legacy system. So we need to actually literally go to the drawing board and redesign and make it cloud ready. The longest, the most complicated and time consuming, well, maybe not complicated, but time consuming process you might look at your strategic decision, right? And this information, once we do the rationalization process, choose our top 5, for example, although Cloud Option Framework recommends 10, but let's say top 5 services we want to move, we need to determine within which 4 groups they would appear as services inside Azure. Now, as far as the lessons learned goes, right? Yeah, inventory takes time. The rationalization process would be the key to your success, because especially the incremental one, because it will speed up certain things. Yeah, when you do it initially, it's not always easy to ask the tough questions, but I'll tell you from personal experience, after my 3rd iteration, I'll kind of get more proficient, because as you create disruption in way of thinking and looking at things, when you come to the business side does that to you, right? They might ask something from a business or a power user perspective that you never figure out as an IT operations, right? Even the IT operations people haven't figured that one out, right? Somebody coming and asking various questions, there is no wrong question, right? There is no stupid question in this area, right? We need to learn as much as possible about the system and the process we want to do while moving that service to the cloud, right? If you can avoid the rehosting option, right, go for re-platform, re-architect, right? Maybe start from scratch, then go for it, right? Moving an infrastructure workload in the infrastructure in Azure moves it with already existing problems and pain points, right? Yes, I like the move and improve, but the improved part is not always effective for certain workloads, especially if they're more legacy, they're out of support operating system, there's something else, right? Yes, we can contain it to a certain level, but from a practical perspective, that will be a little bit too much to handle ultimately at the end of the day. Now, I worked in a couple of scenarios where the move and improve process was the kind of go-to, which happened due to 2 reasons. First, the operational teams were proficient in that area. Their business criticality reason was pressuring them, so I was trying to delay as much as possible and do some kind of creative thinking, but that was left for the next iteration, next phase. But we prepped the baseline infrastructure so they can run the infrastructure side but expand further down the road with platform services if it's necessary and integrate those segments. But either way, it also caused some additional testing from an operational perspective, right? Because they also realized that the operational procedures they run in the on-premises hosted data center are not the same with Azure, due to dependency on Microsoft support and operations, as well as some capabilities that were not there in on-premises now allow them to kind of pimp a little bit and improve the operational procedures, right? So we ultimately ended in testing for 3.5 weeks, 22 different operating procedures for their operations teams in the background. Now, you should always remember, right? We're moving from on-premises services to distributed asynchronous environment, which implies that the following: you're moving on-premises services to a distributed and asynchronous environment, which boils down to the thing I said earlier. The on-premises data centers are static infrastructure, right, compared to what happens in the cloud. I sometimes compare Azure with a kind of a tornado. It kind of sucks us in and we enjoy the beautiful stuff inside, so in a positive way, if I may use the term. Maybe it's not a good analogy there, but it's constantly changing and happening, right? And then it's a distributed and asynchronous environment, which means certain operations that were valid for the static on-premises environment won't be valid inside the Azure anymore. So be ready for that. It's a disruptor technology. Now, important component also to consider is the organizational alignment, right? So it boils down to what's the size of the organization primarily, because we don't have always the luxury to set up a separate cloud adoption team, then cloud governance teams, and then separate security teams and other operational teams till we get to the ultimate infrastructure where we handle center of excellence capabilities, right? So the model is you starting either from a specific organizational chart for a large organization where there is a specific management hierarchies, and then we set up a separate hierarchy that will run the cloud adoption process. Or we create a virtual team, which means we pull certain resources from the org chart environment and create a virtual team that will handle the cloud adoption. And then we start restructuring further and then kind of dismantle the environment and which give us a specific task-oriented capabilities. The mixed model has the organizational chart environment, and then we pull certain people towards our virtual teams that handle certain cloud operations and tasks related to that. But then we need to maintain both infrastructures. Now that's the complex one. Every model has its pros and cons. They're kind of in detailed inside the framework. But it all boils down to the RACI matrix, right? Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed, right? And based on that, we can do proper alignment inside. Again, a very valid discussion with a large organization, not that valid with a small organization, where a single or few people wear too many hats inside. So if you look at the maturity structure process, again, part of the adoption framework, right? At early stages, we look at the adoption, right? We try, we create some simple cloud adoption plan, we throw in some resources, we start building the best practices. We match the process of the cloud adoption team. Once we assign a cloud governance group to that process, right, we're looking at the viable product, right, based on which we'll draw some best practices so we can reuse that knowledge for further products we want to move to Azure, right? Once it gets a kind of a foothold, we would also at this step involve the central IT operation, right, which means that certain controls and operating procedures that are valid for on-premises. So the things we learn from the MVP, right, the viable product best practices model with the cloud adoption and cloud governance team can be transposed to the central IT, right? So any form of a control due to integration with cloud services as well as the operating model, right? I was doing some governance assessment earlier for a client, and we came to a situation where they're introducing certain services, certain capabilities, and then suddenly I asked the question about the operating model. So the decision or discussion here was, should we allow everything to be kind of open, or we should disable or close access to specific components of services that are not currently being used by the users. So kind of gradually introducing new services. The opposing customer IT team was, we should open everything. And then ask a simple question. So, okay, you enable component X on service epsilon. I'm a user. I start using it. I encounter a problem. I call help desk. What's the operating model here? Is the help desk ready for this? What's their SLA on this ticketing? What's their training process, right? Were they trained properly so they can mitigate the risk? Were there any trainings for the employees so they can use that functionality? I like the if you don't use it, snooze it model, right? So if I don't use that specific feature or functionality of that service, I shouldn't be able to access it, right? Until my operational model and the governance and controls model is there, right? Then we have the strategic alignment process, right? So where the central IT operations, we do it with the business side, and it's kind of strategically aligned on high level. Now, anything that's supporting those cloud operations would fit within the operational alignment within the organization, and then the ultimate, the highest grade from starting the adoption model with the small cloud adoption team would be the cloud center of excellence, right? Where we would create multiple segments inside virtual teams with specific areas of expertise that have their governance and adoption teams as part of the corresponding buckets inside, right? From that standpoint. All right. Now, as far as the organizational alignment planning phase, right? I mentioned it several times. The cloud adoption process, as such, creates disruption. Disruption in the services we're looking at, as well as the people. Right? That embeds also the processes and ways how we think and how we perceive things. Right? And those disruptions can be positive or negative depending on what's our point of view on that process. Always aim for minimizing the disruption for your or your customer's business. Right? Otherwise, you might find yourself in an unprecedented situation, which would be a problem here. This implies also that you should spend some time on the RACI matrix, right? Determine whether we have, or the organization we're looking at, has the appropriate resources to handle this task. I mean, yeah, I've worked a couple of times as an external consultant to projects, but I'm not there to stay personally, right? Like maybe many of you are, or few of you are. Not to draw assumptions there, right? Yeah, we are a disruptive component within the cloud adoption process as well. So we come from the outside, we give them side ideas. They might replace that specific role with an internal resource once that resource gets proficient, or a new hire from that perspective, right? So we need to also determine whether we need a short, mid, or long-term assignment of different external roles there, right? Whether I'm a consultant, infrastructure engineer, service reliability engineer, whatever there needs to be there, right? It adds on complexity, but then RACI matrix would give us a proper alignment of roles there. As mentioned earlier, the smaller the organization is, the more hats people have, right? I was doing a lift and shift process where after the initial couple of calls I realized that out of 6 people that were mentioned as part of the cloud adoption and the governance and the strategic teams, first and utmost 3 names were always in the list, which meant they're on the RACI matrix, they're all over the place. They were also lacking a security side, which I find and deemed very important. That was one of the remarks in the cloud adoption plan, as well as the final report submitted at the end of the project, that yeah, they should really figure out what to do. And during the strategy and planning phase and the organization alignment process, they also realized that from an operational standpoint, they wouldn't have enough capacity. So they also, within the process, were figuring out how to handle that, and then opted in for an external contractor that will handle all Azure operations once the system is up and running on the other side. Whether that would work from a kind of a long-term perspective, it's a different question, but it is an organizational process that actually the organization consuming that service and environment running in Azure would determine ultimately, right? We can provide suggestions, but ultimately the customer is the one that can define what to do. But yeah, it needs to be considered either way from that standpoint, right? And when we talk about minimize disruption to your business, don't immediately go for the high business impact and highest grade of compliance and security type of project, right? I mean, there is a saying, right, in the States saying, pick the lowest fruits first. Makes sense. So we should look at the services in that perspective to find out what's the lowest hanging fruit service there. But we need to assess it from an IT perspective as well, right? I mean, yeah, if it's a plain static website that can be moved to the Azure, makes sense, but has nothing to do with the business impact when our business processes inside. So the criticality of that service is almost zero, right? I mean, except for defacing and things like that. But yeah, we need to be careful, and then that 3 to 5 list should maybe contain a mix of services, but we should start with the one that causes minimum disruption to the actual business of the org we are looking at. Now I mentioned the organizational skills, which literally does not mean putting, like I've seen organization do, digital transformation in front of every employee role in the org, right? That's just putting a buzzword in your title. I've seen people having their title in the organization had its own business card because it was too big to fit in the person's business card, right? So we need to map depending on the organizational alignments we do and how do we restructure our teams to support these new capabilities, we also need to match the skills. Appropriate trainings, appropriate knowledge, appropriate know-how, right? Level 100, 200, 300, 400, whatever we can assign to them, right? Because they need to be prepped. I give you a sample. I was working a bunch of trainings during a cloud adoption phase for a large organization, and I went into a kind of a vivid discussion with one of the DevOps, or engineering and DevOps would be the cloud role, or in this case the developer that was in a way complaining, why do we learn and study about networking in Azure when there is no networking in platform services? Which boils down to a simple question. So if I provision a service inside Azure, does it linger on somewhere, or when I connect through my Visual Studio or from an external service, it goes through some network? Well, took the person around 15 seconds to realize that, yeah, there is a network. The difference would be, do I see it or not inside the service I'm running? Yeah, and there is a network, of course. It has to be connected to something inside the Azure so it will utilize the resources and capabilities. Another discussion, for example, I had, so we did a lot of different groups training. I did architecture, administration, did some discussions with there. Then I realized there was no network operations personnel on any of the trainings. And I was there for almost a year and a half, almost 2 years actually. And then somebody told me, okay, where are the networking guys? I said, well, it's an external provider. So where are they? He says, I don't know. So they checked with their strategic business alignment and kind of then figured out that there is a gap in their strategy, because they were external and nobody considered to invite them on any of the trainings or discussions internally. They just informed them that they should go for a specific Azure trainings and things like that, but nobody involved them in the process at any point, which is kind of strange. But yeah, somebody in the architecture side, their cloud architect environment, whatever, during the organizational alignment, that network data center engineer role was not present, so they missed it in the organizational restructuring and then skills assignment. So as far as the lessons learned here, besides that, don't forget anyone. Trainings are important. No matter how basic they are, right? You can go for the fundamentals for the business side of the people, so they will understand when you talk about agility and scalability inside the document. But don't use high, medium, low, right? The categories should be mandatory, recommended, optional. Trust me, I've tried high level, high, mid, medium, low, doesn't resonate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that one as well. So mandatory, preferably with red, recommended yellow, optional, go for blue, right? Or something like that. It's important to finish the trainings before a plan phase starts. With a kind of a catch-22 here, what I noticed in my experience is not everybody does the training, or in some cases none of the training is done before we start the journey to the cloud, which makes us a problem, right? Because if I'm prepped and get into the room where the X number of people inside haven't gone to the trainings, even to the basic ones, the ones flagged with mandatory specifically, which of course is a different list when it's a different project at hand. You talk about something, or when you do some workshops about design, architecture, and how you you connect the components, then nobody understands you on the other side. Now, again, I said there are no wrong questions. In this case, there is no wrong question, right? I don't know something, I ask about it, and there is no shame about it. But during a kind of a 2 to 4 hours deep dive architecture session, asking about some fundamentals questions, that alignment is not good there, right? I had several scenarios where I had to go back and explain why this decision was made, why this was not made. And then I realized that the person asking was actually actively reading through the materials that were part of the cloud adoption plan at the session where we at. It's like doing a live test at that point. It doesn't work. I usually leave time. So the latest project I worked, they were like 10 people. I left them almost a month and a half time to prep, considering that they have also other tasks to do, right? So they don't need to sit on Monday and then on Friday go through everything. I give them almost 2 months. They were complaining a couple of times why I didn't start earlier. But once we started, I realized that Catch-22 is in full effect. They did not go through the trainings before we started, although I asked. I had that on my kickoff meeting as a question. They said yes. And then on the second and third meetings, when we started drilling down into details, I said, okay, nobody went through the trainings. And get back to the... So I record the sessions, by the way, with consent of everybody, just for these scenarios. A couple of other things they said they did or they are not going to do, which came issue, but still I had the kickoff meeting recording for minutes of meeting purposes and kind of getting back to the so yeah, that's also, if they agree, please record the sessions when you do virtually kickoffs. Ultimately, if we finalize everything, we'll get a structure like this, right? So we have the prerequisites section in the cloud adoption plan. We define and prioritize the workloads. Says first 10 by default, but I would not go more than 5. Align the specific assets based on the prioritization list. So from a people time material, right? As well as the other components related to the service. Once again, revisit the rationalization. Make sure that you have all the things in order. Define specific iteration releases. Right. One of the assumptions, especially for me being an outside element inside an org, yes, I can commit to 8 hours per day. Well, if I deduct some biology break and lunch break and things like that, let's say effective 6 hours per day. But the people in the org cannot do that for you. I mean, or if you're on that side, you cannot do that. I estimate usually that up to 4 hours in a best case scenario can be assigned, right? So those time blocks need to be defined. Communication plan needs to be defined, right? Your the other side where the steering committee, that also needs to be defined, right? I had a couple of scenarios where based on the activities done, then somebody says, okay, but we thought this is going to be done and this is not going to be done. So why? So throw it back to the steering committee so they will decide on the other side. So any iteration and release should be planned. So this is some agile methodology here, and do some rough estimation of the timelines. Right. Give a framework of what the activities and tasks would go as part of the investment in that perspective, right? Now there is a methodology how you can do that, but I always go for Abel Squid's model that yeah, given the time, he would probably design a whole operating system within a few days. But if you're not sure, then estimate each task as a 4-hour block, and then work on that one. Right, he was a great guy. So, lessons learned. However it is, go for the cloud adoption plan, right? I know there is a template there, might look funny at the first time, but do it, create it, use it, right? It's not written in stone, right? You can revise and update it, but just don't spend too much time on doing that from that standpoint. Remember that your first iteration probably won't look the best, but once you get a couple of iterations, you'll get to, right? My first plan was 7 pages. Now I can do 20 pages like this because I already know what goes where and I already get the knowledge behind me, right? But it will come to you as well if you're not that proficient. Estimated timeline is a good reference to size the process. People, time, cost, all the materials related to the project. It's not necessarily to be a detailed work breakdown. So I don't know, task 1, right, milestone 1, there are 7 tasks inside and each task, and then things like that. Again, use the 4-hour block, things like that. It might help. It will give you some rough assessment, right? Normalize the time frame. So don't say, okay, I'm going to write a document 1 hour 35 minutes, then 15 minutes tea, then I don't know, 30 minutes talking to a customer. Create a rough estimation block. It will give them the perception what time and what allocation of people they need to do within the time frame, and of course assess the cost for the project. Now let's go to the ready side, right? So in here we need to discuss what operating model we're going to use, Gonna throw a glimpse on the landing zone, design area, some implementation options are here. As far as the design area goes, right, so we have the environment and we have the compliance side. On the environment side, we have the Azure environment, so it's billing. What's the number of subscriptions I'm going to use? Also, don't overdo it there. What's my structure of the Azure Active Directory tenant? Is it cloud only? Is it maybe multiple tenants in some cases? Is it connected to on-premises in a hybrid scenario? And then I have different complexity on the other side. Then we need to work on our identity and access management, because we introduced the cloud side where certain rules and models exist, which are not identical to the one on premises, starting from the protocols we use to connect to the Azure, to the Active Directory side, up to how the structure is comprised. How do we organize the resources? And last but not least, the network topology and connectivity, especially if it's a hybrid or I have multiple locations around the world and I have to interconnect different Azure data centers. The compliance side handles security governance management. And then, of course, if we want to have a kind of a more structured and predictable approach, the platform automation and ultimately the developer operations, right? Integration overall, right? And again, in Azure, as per the cloud option framework, the configuring of initial environment starts with the landing zone construct, right? This is a kind of a match to our technical requirements for the solution we run, right? There are multiple options you can find in the cloud option framework. Start small, enterprise, and things like that. You can review them and start figuring out which one gives you the best approach, right? So on the right side, we have the management group assigned to a subscription. We have the appropriate resource groups and applications and service components deployed inside in a specific particular order. And then that's covered in the architecture and design session inside the cloud option framework. The idea is to create the foundation, right? So the screenshot illustrative on the right side handles policy, right? Some primitives, identity, network, data, storage, compute. It refers to a blueprint, but yeah, blueprints, it's something that will probably go away soon enough. So probably biceps and template specifications, things like that would be the thing to go from this standpoint. But you will find blueprints or templates for different cloud option framework landing zone constructs, from a basic one to a specific related to some standards for shared services, for migration, etc., etc. Right? So once you look at them, you will find the one that works best and start working and adapting it to that one. So we have the architectures and you have the reference implementations inside, which would be more than good enough to do it. As far as how do we implement it, right? Yeah, if I can check all the boxes, then I can go for it, right? This also implies larger organization, better structure, right? I have to figure out the billing, the tenant structure, the identity access management, network topologies, connectivity, my resource organization is properly done, governance management, security model, and ultimately I have platform automation and DevOps. But for small mid-sized organizations, or right, if we look at it, we choose several workloads and then we move. We check few boxes, then do a portion of the implementation, and then we do iteration check, and then again we move to additional few boxes. So I don't know, we established the identity access management, the network topology, connectivity, Azure billing, right? And we start the resource organization, and then we do iterations, for example. We have the governance management security again, we have the baseline, and then build upon it as we add new resources and we organize accordingly and place them in a specific landing zone construct. Then we adapt the governance management security to adapt that, and ultimately we automate the platform. As far as the the landing zone accelerator is there, but you can also utilize from different partner landing zones you can find. You have the start small and expand model. You have the ultimate enterprise scale landing zone, as well as third parties, mainly let's say supported by HashiCorp Terraform as an option. But either way, it's part of the overall journey, and then you decide, or the customer will decide together with you how you would proceed further. Now, on the adoption side, we used to have migrate and innovate, but one of the next step is actually modernize. That's considered kind of a high level. When you talk about migrate, that's actually the move and improve, right? We do assessment of the workloads, we deploy the workloads, we release so we deploy or move the workloads to to the Azure side, and then we release them to production. Uh, right, so that happens once the functionality is replicated. On the modernized side, we need to identify specific business goals that are relevant to the application we're looking at. So this is the business alignment side that happens in the first phase. Uh, we determine which workloads we need to actually modernize and how we're going to do the modernization, right? Per workload in this case. And then we can move to phase two, which is implement the specific modernization strategies, where we focus on two sub areas here. We look at process modernization, which relates to DevOps operations primarily, or we do application and database modernization process, which means literally using the platform as a service components to accompany that specific effect, or depending on the service, maybe a software as a service environment would be. Last but not least component here is the innovate, which it's kind of back to the drawing board and start from literally scratch of the environment, right? So it's based on creating a so-called hypothesis in correlation with specific business value for which we reach consensus with the business side. Then we look and start building our first minimum viable process, the MVP. Based on that, we do measurements and learn. And then we expand in further areas of digital innovation, and these are the 5 areas which are perceived in this environment. Now, any of these 3 models can be relevant to the organization where you work or you collaborate with on that topic. Last but not least, we have the security, governance, and management, right? And each component has its own specific tasks and capabilities that are run inside the environment. Let's look at the security, right? We have the risk insights, which need to be part of our management framework and any digital initiative we run, like the zero trust, the defense in depth, whatever. Then we need to have the security integration, right? Because we have some security insights on the systems we run on premises, or maybe we haven't had those systems before. Once we utilize the cloud side, so we can actually mix and match and integrate whatever security discipline was established on premises with the one in the cloud, so expand and improve, right? And then on the business third pillar would be business resilience, right? Whatever form of attack happens against the organization, we either continue working or we can rapidly get to full operational status, right? As far as the discipline goes, we have the access control based on the zero trust, we have the security operations, detect, respond, and recover, hunting, right? Interact with threat intelligence community on a worldwide scale in this case, looking at Azure. Asset protection, right? Discovery, classification, securing. We have the security governance model, and then any form of innovation we can run in that. So, right, as time progresses, whatever innovation we use the earliest stage, we have to innovate again and then implement some additional features and functionalities as time progresses, right? The usual suspects here. We have the identity management access control, right? We're looking at the digital representation of a person, right, that has access to certain resources, which means the identity, who am I in that environment, is my primary security parameter. Use centralization of identity, right? So this is also part of the well-architected framework, for example. So Azure Active Directory should be considered in this case as a recommendation as our enterprise or centralized identity management, right? If I have multiple tenants, I manage them, I connect to them and manage them with a separate set of tools, right? Use single sign-on, conditional access. Again, security is not written in stone, right? We need to do routine security improvements. Password management, multi-factor authentication should be considered. Role-based asset control. And do not use the generic built-in ones. Use the service-specific. If the service-specific does not fit the bill, customize the role, but do not create a super role. I do not create a custom role out of 3 different RBAC roles. I don't want to split. Because you'll create gaps. You downscale it, right? So if it's, I don't know, role X, then kind of create a role X minus 1, if I may use the analogy. So reduce as much as possible the attack surface on the custom role. Lower the exposure of privileged accounts. It can start from not using the obvious names and things like that, as well as use privileged entity, privileged access management controls. Control the locations where resources are created, not only from closeness to the from an operational perspective, but governance, risk, security, compliance. Actively monitor for suspicious activities. Integrate Azure Active Directory and as much possible services as you can because of the built-in protection capabilities. On the governance side, right, we have the business risk, which it's part of documenting the ever-evolving business risk and what's the tolerance of the business for that specific risk on the data classification and specific application security. Policy and compliance, right? Any risk decision should be converted to a policy statement, and then that would establish the so-called cloud adoption boundary, right? What's the area I can expand myself to? And then processes, right? We need to have a process to monitor the violations in correlation to our established corporate policies. As far as the 5 discipline goes, we have the cost management, security baseline, resource consistency, identity baseline, deployment acceleration, right? So cost management is related to looking at the cost side in conjunction with security and operational excellence, right? A simple sample like that, if there is a denial of service attack on a specific service, it will be picked up on the security, right, side, but also the cost might go up for that specific service. So, a faulty code was pushed through the DevOps, and then the service starts over provisioning additional instances. Yeah, from an operational efficiency side, yeah, that's not good, but on the other side, a cost will spike. So we can actually revert back the information to IT. Establish specific security baseline, and again, whatever you do, and there is quite an extensive guidance on that, start with a baseline and then expand. Resource consistency goes in hand maybe with the deployment acceleration. So we use templates, automation, right? The infrastructure as a code side to enable flawless provisioning and configuration of specific services in regards to onboarding, but also for recovery and eventual discoverability of those services, and then use some form of templating. And then identity baseline. Again, what roles and how I can be assigned to a role, what security groups I'm going to use, then which roles will be assigned to those security groups, and then what RBAC model or identity and access management will be applied to those security groups inside the Azure resources. As far as the resource consistency, right, it's part of the governance and model. It starts with the management group, subscription, resource group, and then applying appropriate governance model on top of it, right? In regards to security policies, then we have the security side, Azure policy, sorry, then we have the security side, where the appropriate role-based access control mechanism is applied. How we structure, how we group the resources within the resource groups, it's bound to what the landing zone construct, right, from a technical requirement is, and how do we structure it, so there is no kind of golden rule there. But I had different implementations of the resource group structure in regards to the subscriptions or management groups. Either way, don't go beyond 3 in vertical management groups, and don't go on a frenzy of assigning gazillion subscriptions. I worked with a customer, with the ones with the 100 and something applications. They had 5 environments per application, which meant 5 subscriptions per application. So they had more than 600 applications in their environment. That was messy, but that's how they opted in as a model. As far as the management methodology, right, as far as the business is concerned, we have the criticality, impact, and commitment side on the management, right? We need to determine what's the critical, so low, medium, high business impact of the workload we are running. What's the impact based on criticality? Because any interruption is only time, but it will cause also financial loss on the other side, and then operational strain and things like that. And then we have to set up some form of KPIs or commitments, right, in regards to cost and performance. So as far as the cloud operation disciplines, we have the inventory and visibility, operational compliance, protect and recover, platform operations, and then we have the workload operations here as part of the environment. But either way, we have to have some form of visibility on the telemetry that these transported workloads have inside the Azure, right? We should be applying as much as possible and where possible automation and establish specific controls, right? Limit the factor of error that can happen inside. We need to utilize the embedded capabilities of the platform to protect the services we run, the workloads we're running, as well as enable the resilience and scalability of this service, right, for rapid recovery specifically. We use the platform and we create a common ground for the platform, so it will run multiple diverse workloads in parallel by optimizing, right, the operational side, the inventory and visibility, and the scalability and agility, including the security and governance model on top of the environment. And then we need also to understand the workload telemetry, right? Performance versus reliability. Now that would probably not impact the cost side, because the more critical system is and has higher impact, then we would probably invest more on the workload operation side. But then it's a trade-off, right? So do not overdo it on one side or the other, of course. As far as the kind of lessons learned, if you don't pick up something by now, on secure, govern, and manage side, right? So when you're in doubt, always go for the baseline, right? There is a set of actionable best practices, well architected framework security. You have the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, or it was used to call Azure Security Benchmark, and then educate yourself, the team members, people around. It's an evolving story, it never stops. You should work on the operating model, right? And it should be determined early in the stage of the process, right? Do we use a decentralized model, centralized, enterprise, distributed operations? And each model is also part of the framework, so we can drill down a little bit around that one. Always remember that common responsibility or irresponsibility does not exist. Goes back to the RACI matrix, right? Smaller organization, there will be a gap. It needs to be there. They need to be aware of it. They need to react on it. Ignoring something, it won't make it go away. Not defining things doesn't mean that if something good happens, then I will be the good person. Ooh, yeah. But if something bad happens, you're all to be blamed. I've seen and worked in an organization like it doesn't work. I mean, from a decision standpoint, I cannot make the decision if I'm not the responsible person for that. I might be informed, might say some piece of my mind there, but ultimately the responsibility relies in a specific role we define there. And if we don't have it, we need to figure out how to fill in the blanks. It's a kind of ultimate takeaways, right? You should understand specific business priorities and motivations in your organization or your customer organization. Whatever cloud operating model you decide on, validate whether it's feasible or not. Define the governance, security, and compliance, especially in the enterprise scale landing zone. Gives more complexity, but the baseline works for small and mid-sized organizations as well. Skilling and organizational alignment requirements are important. Right, that will identify not only the knowledge gaps but also the people skills gaps in general, and then figure out how to fill those either by training or new hires or external support. Explore different environment designer areas. It is your conceptual architecture. It's not written in stone, right? You can adapt it, modify it, use it, reuse it, right? It's not one size fits all. Always build at least minimum basic governance foundation to support these low risk assets, and then learn from that so you can expand further down the line as you move to the towards the ultimate goal, right? And last but not least, once you figure out this, deploy the workloads based on the findings and then rinse and repeat. And iterate, iterate, iterate. Now, a couple of useful links, post them in the chat as well for this that are relevant to the topics at hand. With this, I would like to thank you for attending and being part of this session. Please visit the festivetechcalendar.com and the YouTube channel so you can enjoy additional sessions and see and or explore what's next. With that, I wish to tell you happy holidays and see you in the next iteration. Thank you. Bye bye.